Rome, July 21, 1773. An old man signs a document that destroys an army. His name is Pope Clement XIV. The document is called Dominus Ac Redemptor. With his signature, the most powerful religious order on earth. 23,000 men, more than 700 schools, missions on 5 continents, ceases to exist. The Pope has just abolished the Vatican's own elite. 14 months later, he is dead, and Rome fills with whispers of poison. Tonight, we are not going to tell you that the Jesuits were the Vatican's secret assassins. The evidence does not support that claim. What historians have spent careers documenting is something stranger: how one order became the most feared organization in Europe, why kings expelled it, why a pope destroyed it, and why the legend of the Jesuit killer refuses to die. Where the record is established, you will know it. Where it is debated, you will know that too. Settle in, let the room go quiet, and listen carefully. Chapter 1. The Soldier Who Could Not Walk. Pamplona, northern Spain, May 20, 1521. A French cannonball is in the air. It is moving toward a fortress wall, where a 30-year-old Basque nobleman stands with his sword drawn. He is trying to convince a garrison of exhausted men to keep fighting a battle that everyone except him understands is already lost. His name is Inigo de Loyola. History will remember him by the Latin version of that name, Ignatius. But on this particular afternoon, he is not a saint. He is not a founder. He is certainly not the future general of an order that kings will learn to fear. He is a minor courtier with expensive tastes, a carefully maintained head of hair, a record of street brawls, and at least one criminal charge that quietly disappeared. His ambition has attached itself entirely to the profession of arms. The cannonball ends that profession in a single instant. It passes between his legs. It shatters one leg and tears open the other. He falls where he stood, and the fortress surrenders soon after. The French soldiers, who by the custom of the age admired courage even in an enemy, set his bones as well as they could and carried him home to his family castle on a litter. The journey took days, over rough country, every jolt of the litter grinding the broken leg. What happens next tells you everything about the man. The doctors at the castle found that the leg had been set badly. A lump of bone protruded below the knee. The leg was left shorter than the other. For most soldiers of the era, that was simply the price of a military life. You limped, and you lived. Ignatius could not accept it, not because of the pain, not because the leg would fail him, because of how it would look in the fitted hose that a fashionable courtier wore at court. He ordered the surgeons to break the leg again, to saw off the protruding bone, to stretch the limb with weights. For weeks, there was no anesthesia in 1521. Witnesses later recalled that he endured it without crying out, fists clenched. Face pale. This is the man at the center of our story. A will of almost frightening strength in the service, at this point in his life, of almost complete vanity. The transformation that followed is one of the best documented conversions in religious history, partly because Ignatius himself dictated an account of it near the end of his life. Historians treat that account with care, as they treat all memoirs, but its core sequence is not seriously disputed. During the long convalescence, flat on his back through a brutal summer, Ignatius asked for books. He wanted the chivalric romances that were the popular entertainment of his class. Stories of knights, ladies, and impossible quets. The castle had none. What it had was a life of Christ, and a thick collection of lives of the saints. He read them because there was nothing else to read, and somewhere in those slow months, the machinery of his ambition found a new object. He began to daydream in two directions. In one set of daydreams, he performed great deeds at court and won the favor of a great lady. In the other, he imagined outdoing the saints themselves, walking barefoot to Jerusalem, fasting like the desert hermits, giving up everything. Then he noticed something. The daydreams of glory left him feeling dry afterward, empty, like a fire that burns fast and leaves nothing. The daydreams of radical devotion left a kind of lasting quiet that stayed with him for days. He began to treat his own inner reactions as evidence, as data worth recording and examining. John W. O'Malley, the Jesuit historian, whose 1993 book, The First Jesuits, remains the standard scholarly account of the order's beginnings, makes a point about this moment that is worth holding for the rest of this story. The method Ignatius was discovering was not, at its root, about doctrine. It was about decision-making, about observing the movements of one's own mind with the discipline of a soldier inspecting his equipment. That method would eventually be written down as a small book called the Spiritual Exercises. 5 centuries later, that small book is still in print, and retreat houses across America and Europe still run programs built on it, often for people who have no idea who wrote it or why. It became the engine that produced the men Europe would learn to call Jesuits. But that was decades away. First came the failures. It is one of the strangest features of this history, and one the legend almost never includes. That the man who built the most formidable educational network on earth spent his 30s failing at nearly everything he attempted. He left the castle as soon as he could ride. At a mountain shrine, he hung up his sword before an image of the Virgin. Like a knight from one of the romances he could no longer take seriously, he gave his fine clothes to a poor man, an act of charity that got the poor man briefly arrested on suspicion of theft. Then he disappeared into a cave near a town called Manresa. He stayed the better part of a year. He prayed for hours a day. He fasted until his health broke, and kind strangers had to nurse him back. He let his hair and nails grow wild, the dandy of Pamplona burning away piece by piece. And in a notebook, he began setting down the spiritual method taking shape inside him. From there he sailed for Jerusalem, intending to spend his life near the holy places. The Franciscan authorities who managed those sites ordered him to leave within weeks. A freelance mystic with no training and no money was a liability they did not want. So he came home and did something almost comic for a 33-year-old veteran of war. He sat down in a classroom in Barcelona, among young boys, to learn basic Latin grammar. He studied next at the university town of Alcalá. There, the Spanish Inquisition arrested him and questioned him, an uneducated layman, giving spiritual direction to crowds of devout women, fit the profile of a heretic. He spent weeks in a cell. He was released, but ordered to stop teaching about matters of faith until he had completed formal studies. He moved to Salamanca. It happened again. Another cell, another investigation, another release without conviction. Stay with that detail for a moment. The founder of the order that would later be accused of running the Inquisition's darkest errands began his religious life as a prisoner of the Inquisition. The historical record of the Jesuits is full of these reversals, and this will not be the last one you hear tonight. In 1528, he arrived at the University of Paris, the most demanding academic environment in Europe. He was 37 years old. He was poor enough that he spent part of each year begging funds. He walked on a badly healed leg. He stayed 7 years, and it was there, in shared student lodgings, that the future order began, not as a plan, as a friendship. His roommates were 2 younger men. One was Francis Xavier, a brilliant and ambitious athlete from Navarre, proud of his noble blood, who at first found the limping older student irritating. The other was Pierre Favre, a gentle scholar from the mountains of Savoy, who suffered from anxieties and scruples that tormented him, un by un, patiently, over years. Ignatius guided each of them through the spiritual exercises, one by one. The trajectory of their lives bent. By 1534, there were 7 of them. On a summer morning, in a small chapel on the hill of Montmartre in Paris, they took private vows of poverty and chastity, and a shared promise to travel together to Jerusalem. War between Venice and the Ottoman Empire closed the sea routes. Jerusalem was impossible. So the companions walked to Rome instead, to place themselves at the disposal of the Pope, to be sent wherever he judged best. In 1540, Pope Paul III formally approved their new order. The name they had chosen for themselves was the Company of Jesus, later rendered in Latin as the Society of Jesus. 2 details from that founding moment deserve your attention, because the legend has distorted both. First, the word company. Generations of writers, hostile and admiring alike, treated it as a military term, the company of soldiers. From it, they built the image of the Jesuits as the Pope's shock troops. O'Malley's research points the other way. In the language of the founders, the word carried the sense of companionship. The circle of friends from Paris. The military reading came later, and mostly from outsiders. The order's enemies needed an army to be afraid of. So, they heard one in the name. Second, the scale. The papal approval initially capped the order at 60 members. 60, the organization that would one day be accused of secretly steering every court in Europe, began as a group small enough to fit in a single lecture hall. Even its name began as mockery. The word Jesuit was first used by critics as an insult, and only later adopted by the order's own members. The way unwanted nicknames sometimes become flags. By the time Ignatius died in Rome in 1556, still working at his desk almost to the end, the 60 had become roughly 1,000. Colleges were opening across Europe. Missionaries were already in India, in Brazil, and in Japan. 1,000 men in 16 years, built around a training method that could take an ordinary recruit and produce something disciplined, educated, mobile, and loyal. Europe had never seen an organization quite like it, and Europe was about to discover that the only thing it feared more than an army it could see was one it could not. Chapter 2. An Army Without Weapons. Rome, 1558. 2 years after the death of Ignatius, in a plain room near a church in the center of the city, a priest is surrounded by paper. His name is Juan Alfonso de Polanco. For the last decade of Ignatius's life, he served as his secretary, and the word secretary does not begin to cover it. Polanco ran the correspondence of the entire society. Letters to missionaries in India, instructions to colleges in Sicily, reports from Brazil, summarized, filed, answered. Scholars who have catalogued the surviving letters from Ignatius's office count thousands upon thousands of them, one of the largest correspondences of the entire 16th century, flowing out of a single modest house in Rome. Tonight, Polanco and the men around him are completing a different kind of document. The one their founder spent the last decade of his life writing and rewriting. It is called the Constitutions of the Society of Jesus. It runs to hundreds of pages, and buried inside its careful Latin is the architecture of an organization unlike anything the Catholic Church had produced in 1,000 years. To understand why Europe came to fear the Jesuits, you do not start with what they believed. Their beliefs were standard Catholic doctrine. You start with how they were built. Consider what a religious order looked like before them. Monks lived behind walls. They woke in the night to sing the liturgy of the hours. Every day. In one place. Often for life. A Benedictine took a vow of stability. The monastery itself was the point. The walls were the point. The constitutions deleted nearly all of it. No monasteries in the traditional sense. No distinctive habit. A Jesuit dressed like the ordinary clergy of whatever country he worked in, which to suspicious eyes would soon look less like humility and more like camouflage, and no obligation to sing the daily office together in choir. A change so radical that rival orders protested it for decades. Ignatius had stripped away everything that fixed a religious man to one place, because he was designing for the opposite condition. Mobility. A Jesuit was meant to be deployable, ready to travel anywhere on short notice, living in cities rather than behind walls, working in schools, courts, prisons, plague hospitals, and royal palaces, and wherever he went, he wrote. This is where Polanco's mountain of paper matters. The German historian Marcus Friedrich, whose recent history of the order is among the most complete modern accounts, describes the society as one of the first truly global organizations in human history, held together by ink. Thousands of letters a year moved between the general in Rome and his men on 5 continents. Annual reports, personnel file, evaluations of every member, his talents, his temperament, his judgment, forwarded to headquarters and stored. Let that picture settle for a moment. An organization that is everywhere, that dresses like everyone, that answers to one man in Rome, and that writes everything down. If it sounds to you less like a medieval monastery and more like a modern intelligence service or a multinational corporation, then you have just understood, in a single intuition, about half of the fear this order generated. Its contemporaries had no category for such a thing, so they reached for darker ones. Then there was the vow. Most Jesuits took the 3 standard religious vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. But a select group of the most senior men took a 4th vow, and it is this 4th vow that 3 centuries of conspiracy literature would build upon. It was a vow of special obedience to the Pope. Here is what the legend made of it. A secret oath, binding an army of fanatics to execute any papal command. In the lurid versions, that included murder. Here is what the historical record shows. The text of the 4th vow has never been secret. It has been published and studied for centuries, and it concerns one specific thing: travel. The fully professed Jesuit promised to go wherever the Pope chose to send him, without excuses, and without demanding money for the journey. O'Malley calls it, bluntly, a vow about missions, a guarantee that the order's manpower could be aimed at whatever task the papacy considered most urgent. Germany this year, India the next. The distance between those 2 readings, the assassin's oath and the travel clause, is the distance this entire story lives in. Again and again, a real and documented feature of the order will be taken, stripped of its context, and reforged into something sinister. The pattern starts here, and no phrase suffered it more completely than two words of Latin, perinde ac cadaver. The phrase appears in the constitutions. In a discussion of obedience, it translates as, in the manner of a corpse. A Jesuit's obedience, the text says, should be such that he allows himself to be directed by his superior as if he were a dead body. Or, in the second image, the text offers, like an old man's walking staff, serving wherever it is held. Anti-Jesuit writers quoted those two words for 300 years. Proof, they said, that the order manufactured men without conscience, perfect instruments for any crime. The fuller record is more complicated and considerably more interesting. The corpse image was not even a Jesuit invention. It appears in the writings of Francis of Assisi, 3 centuries earlier. No one ever accused the gentle Franciscans of building an army of automatons, and the same Jesuit constitutions contain a mechanism that the conspiracy literature almost never mentions. It was called the duty of representation. A subordinate who believed an order was mistaken was expected to say so, directly, to the superior who gave it. Obedience, in the documented practice of the order, was the final step of a process that explicitly invited argument before the decision, none of which means the obedience was fiction. It was real, it was demanding, and it gave one man, the superior general in Rome, elected for life, command of a global network. Critics noticed the general acquired a nickname in the pamphlet literature, and it survives to this day. The Black Pope, black for the color of the plain cassock, Pope for the scale of the power. It was never an official title. It was an accusation. The suggestion that behind the white-robed Pope the world could see stood a darker figure it could not. But the true engine of Jesuit influence in these first decades was not the vow and not the general. It was something almost disappointingly wholesome. Schools. Ignatius had not planned to run schools at all. The first companions were preachers and missionaries. But in 1548, the order opened a school in the Sicilian city of Messina for local boys who were never going to become Jesuits. The experiment succeeded beyond anything they had imagined. Demand exploded. Cities began petitioning Rome for a Jesuit college, the way cities today compete for a university campus or a major employer. With delegations, with promises of buildings, with funds. The schools were rigorous. They were organized around a standardized curriculum, eventually codified in a famous plan of studies published in 1599. So that a boy could move from a classroom in Lisbon to a classroom in Vienna and find the same program waiting, and they were, in principle and usually in practice, free, sustained by endowments rather than tuition. By the early 1700s, the society operated more than 700 colleges and universities across the world, an educational network without precedent, and, arguably, without equal until the rise of modern public school systems. In some Catholic regions of Europe, historians estimate that a substantial share of the entire literate male population had passed through Jesuit classrooms. The model proved so durable that it eventually crossed the Atlantic. The oldest Catholic university in the United States, Georgetown, in Washington, was founded in the Jesuit tradition by a man trained inside this very network. We will meet him, and the strange circumstances of that founding, later in our story. Now sit with the scale of the thing, and you can feel the next 2 centuries of accusation taking shape. What does it mean when one organization, answerable to Rome, educates the lawyers, the judges, the ministers, the bishops, and the kings. Voltaire was educated by Jesuits. So was Descartes. So were generations of the very philosophers and statesmen who would one day turn on the order to the society. The schools were a ministry to its enemies. They looked like the longest infiltration operation in history, the shaping of Europe's ruling class, one schoolboy at a time. Both descriptions point at the same buildings, the same classrooms, the same Latin drills and prize days and worried parents. Which one you saw depended entirely on what you already believed about the men in black. And in one room of the royal palaces of Europe, a room with no crowd and no witnesses, the question of what those men were really doing became the most explosive political issue of the age. That room was the confessional. Chapter 3. The Confessors of Kings. Versailles, France, the 1680s. In the gilded machinery of the most powerful court in Europe, where dukes compete for the honor of handing the king his shirt in the morning, there is one appointment that the pamphlet writers of Protestant Europe track with particular attention. The king's confessor, the man who hears, alone and under absolute secrecy, the sins of Louis XIV, the man who can look at the most powerful monarch on earth and tell him that something he intends to do is morally forbidden, the man who, by long custom of the French court, is always a Jesuit. To understand why this single fact generated more fear of the society than all 700 of its colleges combined, you need to understand what confession meant in a world where politics and salvation were the same subject. A Catholic king was required to confess his sins in order to receive communion. A king who did not receive communion was a public scandal, a crack in the sacred theatre of monarchy. His confessor was therefore not a spiritual luxury. He was a structural part of the state, and his role was different from every minister's. Ministers advised on what was effective. The confessor ruled on what was permitted, whether a planned war was just, whether a new tax was theft from the poor, whether a treaty with Protestant powers could be signed in good conscience, whether the king's mistress was a private weakness or an obstacle to absolution itself. Whoever held that office held a kind of veto located inside the king's own soul, and from the late 1500s onward, across Catholic Europe, that office passed overwhelmingly to members of one order, the historian Robert Byerley, who spent much of his career studying the Jesuit confessors of the 17th century, documented the pattern court by court. Jesuits heard the confessions of the kings of France, of Spain, of Portugal, of the Holy Roman Emperors in Vienna, of the dukes of Bavaria and the kings of Poland, the same order. Every major Catholic throne reporting, by its own constitutions, to a general in Rome. You do not need to invent a single thing to find that arrangement alarming. Contemporaries found it alarming, and not only Protestants, Catholic bishops, rival orders, and royal ministers all asked versions of the same question. When the Jesuit father leans toward the king's ear, whose interests is he serving? The king's soul, or the society's strategy? The historical record gives us at least 3 answers. They do not fit together comfortably. That is usually the sign you are looking at the truth. The first answer is that the confessors held real power, and everyone involved knew it. The clearest case is a priest named François de la Chaise, confessor to Louis XIV for 34 years. Foreign ambassadors reported on his opinions the way they reported on ministers of state. Bishops seeking promotion cultivated his friendship, because the king consulted him on the distribution of church offices across France. A Jesuit priest had become, in function if not in title, the personnel director of the French church. Paris still carries his name. In a place most visitors never connect to him, the most famous cemetery in the city, Père Lachaise, sits on land linked to the country house where the old confessor took his rest. Millions walk through its gates every year. Many of them are Americans looking for the grave of the rock singer Jim Morrison. Almost none of them know they are speaking, in the cemetery's very name, the title of a Jesuit who once held the conscience of the Sun King. The second answer points the opposite way, and the legend never includes it. Kings did not obey their confessors. Kings managed them. Byerly's research on the 30 Years' War, the catastrophic religious conflict that consumed Europe for 3 decades in the early 1600s, found Jesuit confessors repeatedly losing the arguments that mattered most. The emperor in Vienna made peace with Protestant powers over explicit papal objection. Louis XIV allied with Protestant states, and indirectly, even with the Ottoman Empire, whenever French interests required it. No confessor stopped him. When spiritual counsel collided with reasons of state won. Almost every time, a confessor who pushed too hard could be quietly replaced. And some were. The third answer is the one that did the most damage to the society. Because it came with a paper trail, the order's own leadership was afraid of exactly this situation. The Jesuit constitutions warned members away from political entanglement. A general congregation of the order, meeting in the 1590s, formally decreed that Jesuits were not to involve themselves in the secular affairs of princes. The long-serving General Claudio Acquaviva went further. He issued written instructions specifically for confessors of kings, directing them to confine themselves to the conscience of the monarch and to refuse any role in state business. Read those documents one way, and they are proof of innocence. The organization explicitly forbade the very thing it was accused of. Read them the other way, and they are proof of the problem. You do not keep writing rules against something that is not happening. The general kept legislating because his men kept being pulled toward power by kings who found them useful, by the sheer gravity of standing beside a throne, and sometimes, no doubt, by their own ambition. Both readings are defensible. Serious historians hold versions of each. What no one disputes is how it looked, and in the politics of fear, how things look is load-bearing, because here is what an English pamphleteer or a French lawyer of the anti-Jesuit party we could truthfully write in the 17th century. The same international order, bound by a special vow to the Pope, educates the Catholic elite in 700 colleges, stands beside every Catholic throne in the one room where no witness is permitted, and answers to a single unelected general in Rome whom men call the Black Pope. Every clause in that sentence is documented fact, the sinister conclusion drawn from those clauses. A coordinated secret government of Europe is not. 3 centuries of archival research have found rivalry where the legend requires unity, improvisation where it requires master plans. The Jesuit confessors of Paris and the Jesuit confessors of Vienna backed opposite sides of the same wars, because they were Frenchmen and Austrians long before they were anything else. But notice what has happened across these first 3 chapters. We have not yet needed a single forgery, not one invented document, not one lie. The honest facts alone were enough to draw the silhouette of a shadow government. Now imagine what a motivated liar could do with material like that. You do not have to imagine. In the year 1614, in the Polish city of Kraków, A printing press produced a small book that claimed to reveal the secret instructions of the Society of Jesus. It was a fake, written by a bitter man the order had thrown out. It became one of the most successful forgeries in the history of the printed word. And it is where our story goes next. Chapter 4. The Forgery That Built a Legend. Kraków, Poland. 1614. A small book is coming off a printing press, and it claims to be stolen. Its Latin title is Monita Secreta, the secret instructions of the Society of Jesus. The title page implies that the text was smuggled out of hidden Jesuit archives, that what the reader holds is the real constitution behind the public one, the playbook shown only to the most trusted men, the mask removed at last, and the contents deliver everything the title promises. The instructions explain how Jesuits should worm their way into the confidence of princes, how they should target rich widows, isolate them from their families, and steer their fortunes toward the society, how they should destroy the reputations of men who leave the order, how they should pursue wealth and power relentlessly while preaching poverty in public, every act of charity. The book whispers, is calculated theater. It reads, in other words, exactly like what Europe already suspected. That sentence is the key to this entire chapter. Keep it beside you. First, the question of authorship, which scholars consider settled. The Italian historian Sabina Pavone, who wrote the standard modern study of the Monita, traces the book to a Polish priest named Hieronym Zachorowski. He was a real Jesuit, and shortly before the book appeared, the order had dismissed him. He knew the society from the inside. He knew its vocabulary, its structure, the dry administrative rhythm of its official documents. And he used that insider's fluency to write a fake that sounded right. The Monita does not read like a rant. It reads like a memo. That was its genius. The Church investigated almost immediately. Within 2 years, the Holy Office examined the text and condemned it as a forgery. Bishops denounced it. The order published refutations, pointing out that no original manuscript had ever been produced, that the supposed secret rules contradicted the order's actual constitutions, which were public, that the document had surfaced, conveniently, through a dismissed member with a grievance. By the normal logic of evidence, that should have been the end. What happened instead is the reason this book matters to history. The Monita Secreta became a bestseller, and it stayed one for 300 years. Pavone's research counts edition after edition. Latin, French, German, English, Dutch, Spanish, Italian. It was reprinted in France during the Jesuit crisis of the 1760s. Right when it was politically useful, it was reprinted across the 19th century. It crossed the Atlantic and circulated in the United States during waves of anti-Catholic feeling. Presented to American readers as a genuine captured document, there are editions from the 20th century. There are websites quoting it tonight. More than 400 years after a bitter man in Poland wrote it, that still call it authentic. Why did the debunking never catch up to the lie? This is where the story stops being a curiosity about one old book and becomes a study in how manufactured belief actually works. The mechanics deserve to be examined slowly, because once you see them, you will recognize them in every century that follows, including, perhaps, your own. The first mechanism is this. The forgery did not create the suspicion. It confirmed it. Remember where the last chapter left us. By 1614, Honest and documented facts had already drawn a worrying silhouette. The global order, the single general, the schools shaping the elite, the confessor beside every throne. Europe was already asking what the Jesuits were really doing behind all that discipline. The Monita arrived as the answer to a question its audience had already formed. A forgery that tells people something new must fight for belief. Inch by inch. A forgery that tells people they were right all along is welcomed like a returning friend. The door is already open. The second mechanism is that the forgery was unfalsifiable by design. Ask a Jesuit whether the secret instructions are real, and he will of course say no, but the Monita itself instructs members to deny the document's existence. The denial becomes the proof. There is a terrible elegance to that trap. There is no possible response that does not feed it. Silence is guilt. Denial is guilt performing itself. It is a perfect machine. And it is the signature move of conspiracy literature in every era since. Any evidence against the theory is simply reclassified as evidence of the cover-up. The third mechanism is the most uncomfortable one. An honest telling cannot leave it out. Parts of the caricature touched real behavior. The society in the early 1600s was wealthy in places. Its colleges did receive large legacies. Some of those legacies did come from devout widows. Rival orders and angry families did sometimes feel outmaneuvered by Jesuit fundraising, and said so loudly, none of that required secret instructions. It required talented men, a prestigious institution, and the ordinary economics of religious patronage, which have looked the same in every faith and every century. But it meant that a reader of the Monita could look around his own city and find something that seemed to match the script. A widow here, a legacy there, a lawsuit between a family and a college. The forgery harvested real grievances and gave them a sinister explanation. That is the anatomy of the thing. A primed audience, en une falsifiable structure, and a thin anchor line tied to genuine fact. Pavone makes one further point, and it lifts this chapter onto the main track of our story. The Monita Secreta did not remain a book. It became a template, the figure it constructed, the soft-spoken infiltrator, loyal to a foreign master, working through schools and influence rather than armies, proved portable. Later centuries lifted the pattern whole and aimed it at other groups. Scholars who study the infamous anti-Jewish forgery known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, fabricated around the year 1900, have documented the structural resemblance and, in some elements, lines of direct descent running through 19th-century French conspiracy literature. The secret instructions of a hidden elite, conveniently discovered, impossible to disprove. The men who built that later forgery, with all the horror that flowed from it, did not have to invent its architecture. A dismissed Jesuit in Krakow had drafted the blueprint 3 centuries earlier, but in 1614, all of that lies far in the future. In 1614, the Monita is simply the newest weapon in a war of words that has just turned deadly serious, because by the time the forgery appeared, the accusation against the society was no longer that its members flattered widows or whispered to kings. 2 French kings had been attacked with knives. A plot to blow up the English Parliament had been uncovered, barrels of gunpowder and all. And in courtrooms in Paris and London, prosecutors were arguing that the trail of blood led back to the men in black. The charge was the gravest one a monarchy knew how to make: killing kings. Chapter 5. Regicide on Trial. Paris, December 27, 1594. King Henry IV of France is in a room full of courtiers when a 19-year-old student lunges at him with a knife. The blade misses the throat it was aimed at. It strikes the king's face, splitting his lip and breaking a tooth. Henry survives. The attacker is seized on the spot, still holding the knife. His name is Jean Châtel, and under interrogation, he reveals the detail that will set France on fire. He was educated at the Jesuit College of Clermont. Within days, the case becomes a trial of the entire society. Officers search the college. In the room of a priest named Jean Guignard, they find old papers containing writings against the king, composed years earlier, during the civil wars, when much of Catholic France, not only Jesuits, had opposed Henry as a Protestant usurper. Guignard had never met Châtel. Châtel himself, questioned under torture, did not claim that any Jesuit had directed him toward the act. It did not matter. Guignard was hanged, and his body burned. The Society of Jesus was banished from France by order of the High Court of Paris. Its members marched to the borders, condemned collectively as corrupters of the young. How does the crime of one former student condemn an entire order? To answer that, you have to know what Europe had lived through in the previous decade, and you have to know what certain Catholic writers, including some Jesuits, had been putting on paper. This is the heart of the matter. It deserves to be stated with precision, because it is the closest thing to a real foundation under the legend of the Jesuit assassin. In the late 1500s, serious Catholic theologians were openly debating a genuinely dangerous question. Is it ever lawful to kill a tyrant? The debate was not new. It ran back through medieval philosophy to the ancient world. But the wars of religion had dragged it out of the lecture hall. In 1589, King Henry III of France had been assassinated by a fanatical young friar named Jacques Clement. Mark this carefully, because the legend never does. Clement was a Dominican, not a Jesuit. No order was ever shown to have directed him. But the killing proved that the question of tyrannicide was no longer theoretical. It had entered the street, carrying a knife. 10 years later, a Jesuit gave the question its most notorious answer. His name was Juan de Mariana, a Spanish scholar of formidable learning. In 1599, he published a book called De Rege, meaning on the king, written as advice for the education of the future King of Spain. In one section, Mariana examined the killing of tyrants. He did not condemn it. He argued, with conditions and qualifications, that a ruler who destroyed the Commonwealth could, in extreme circumstances, be lawfully removed by private initiative, even killed. And he discussed the recent murder of Henry III in terms that many readers took as approval. Here is what the record shows about how the society handled that book. In Spain, where the politics were different, it appeared with official permissions and caused little stir. In France, where a king had just been stabbed in the face, it was gasoline, and critically, the order's own leadership moved against the doctrine. General Aquaviva formally decreed, in the same year the Monita Forgery appeared, that no Jesuit might teach, publicly or privately, that it is lawful for any person, on un pretext, to kill kings or princes, or to plot their death. Hold both halves of that in your hands at once. A Jesuit wrote the era's most infamous defense of tyrannicide, and the Jesuit order banned the teaching under obedience. One man's book, not an institutional doctrine. The distinction was real. It was also, for the order's enemies, completely useless. The simpler story was already loose in the world, and simple stories travel faster than careful ones. Then came the morning that hardened the story into permanent fact in the English-speaking mind. London. The early hours of November 5, 1605. In a rented cellar directly beneath the House of Lords, searchers with lanterns find a tall man in a cloak, calling himself John Johnson. Around him, stacked under firewood, are 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough to erase King James I, his family, and the entire English Parliament in a single blast. On the very morning the king was to open the session. The man's real name is Guy Fawkes. The gunpowder plot has been discovered. With hours to spare, if you grew up in England, you already know this date. It is burned into the calendar. Remember, the 5th of November. The old rhyme runs, and every year, on bonfire night, effigies still go onto the flames. And if you grew up in America, this story is closer to home than you may think. In colonial Boston, the 5th of November was celebrated for generations as Pope's Day, with anti-Catholic effigies paraded through the streets, until George Washington himself, needing Catholic allies in the Revolution, ordered the practice stopped in his army in 1775, one night in London, echoing for centuries on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, who actually built the plot? The plotters were English Catholic gentlemen, led by a charismatic man named Robert Catesby. Desperate men, watching their faith driven underground by penal laws. They were not Jesuits, but the investigation swept in the head of the Jesuit mission in England, a priest named Henry Garnet, and his case became the lasting one. What the trial established, and what modern historians such as Antonia Fraser have examined in detail, is roughly this. Garnet had learned of the plot indirectly through another priest, who had heard of it under the seal of confession. He had not joined it. The evidence suggests he regarded it with horror and had worked for years to discourage Catholic violence. But he had not warned the government. He held that the seal of confession bound him to silence. For the English crown, that was enough. Garnet was tried before a great audience, condemned, and executed in 1606. And for centuries afterward, English law and English memory treated the gunpowder plot as a Jesuit conspiracy. Penal statutes made the mere presence of a Jesuit on English soil an act of treason. The order's name was fused to the gunpowder in sermons, in pamphlets, in the bonfires themselves. Step back now, as a careful reader of evidence, and weigh what these famous cases actually contain. Across the whole period, the verified record shows Catholic assassins and plotters who were laymen or members of other orders. It shows one Jesuit theologian who defended tyrannicide in print, and a general who banned the doctrine. It shows a Jesuit executed not for plotting, but for keeping silent about a plot he did not join. What 3 centuries of open archives have not produced is documented proof of the Society of Jesus, as an institution ordering the death of any king. And yet, in 1610, Henry IV of France was finally murdered, stabbed in his carriage in a Paris street by a man named François Ravaillac, a disturbed loner with no Jesuit ties, who insisted under torture that no one had sent him. It made no difference. Pamphlets across Europe blamed the society anyway. For a killing its members publicly mourned, committed by a man none of them had ever met. That is what a finished legend looks like. It no longer requires evidence. It generates its own. By the early 1600s, the Jesuits had become the permanent suspect of European politics. And here the story takes the turn that almost no one expects. The permanent suspect sailed away from Europe entirely, to India, to China, to the river forests of South America, and in those distant places, the men in black built things so remarkable, and to certain eyes so threatening, that they would finish what the legend had started. Chapter 6. The Other Empire, Beijing. January 1601. A bearded foreigner in the silk robes of a Chinese scholar is carried through the gates of the Forbidden City. With him come gifts for the emperor, paintings whose strange Western shading makes faces seem to breathe, glass prisms that break sunlight into colors, a harpsichord, and 2 mechanical clocks that chime the hours on their own, as if small bells were trapped inside. In the records of the Ming court, the foreigner's name is Li Madu. In the records of Rome, it is Matteo Ricci, priest of the Society of Jesus. He has spent 18 years working toward this city. Consider what those years contained. He arrived in Asia speaking no Chinese. The language has no alphabet. Thousands of characters, tones that change a word's meaning with a rise or fall of the voice. European traders of the era rarely bothered to learn more than market phrases. Ricci submitted to it completely. The language first, then the classical written canon, the ancient texts that every Chinese official spent a lifetime mastering for the imperial examinations. He had one extraordinary tool, a trained memory. Ricci practiced the old European art of the memory palace, storing information in imagined rooms, and he could perform feats that astonished his hosts, reciting long lists of characters after a single reading, forward and then backward. The historian Jonathan Spence of Yale University built his celebrated study of the man around this image, and describes Ricci as one of the most remarkable cultural mediators in recorded history. Ricci changed his very appearance to be understood. First, he dressed as a Buddhist monk, and found that monks ranked low in the eyes of the scholars he needed. So he changed again, growing his beard, putting on the silk of the Confucian literati. He wrote books in Chinese. One of them, a short treatise on friendship, circulated among the educated elite on its own merits, admired as wisdom, not as foreign curiosity, and he drew a map, a great map of the whole world, annotated in Chinese, showing continents and oceans no Chinese atlas had ever recorded. He made one diplomatic adjustment to the design. He shifted the layout so that China sat near the center of the sheet. The map was reprinted again and again. It hangs in surviving copies, in collections to this day. Ricci never met the emperor face to face. Almost no one did. The Wanli emperor lived in seclusion deep inside the palace. But the clocks Ricci had presented needed winding and care, and only the foreigners knew their mechanisms. So the foreigners stayed, inside the most closed court on earth, by imperial permission, because someone had to keep the bells chiming. When Ricci died in Beijing in 1610, the emperor granted land for his burial, for a European, an honor without precedent. Now lift your eyes from the one man to the pattern, because Europe's rulers certainly did. The Jesuits had reached the one court that European power could not touch, not with armies, not with fleets. They had done it with astronomy, mathematics, and patience measured in decades. In the generations after Ricci, the work only deepened. A German Jesuit rose to direct the Imperial Bureau of Astronomy itself, correcting the Chinese calendar, a task of immense ritual weight for the dynasty. A Flemish Jesuit cast great bronze instruments for the observatory of Beijing and tutored the Kangxi Emperor in geometry. The two of them bent over diagrams in the palace, and everything was written down and sent home. The letters from China flowed back to Rome, and from Rome into published volumes that became bestsellers across Europe. The philosopher Leibniz read the Jesuit reports obsessively and corresponded with the missionaries. Voltaire, no friend of the Church, used Jesuit accounts of Confucian civilization as a weapon against it, holding up China as proof that a moral society could flourish without Christianity at all. Without quite intending it, the society had become something no religious order had ever been. The main information channel between civilizations, knowledge of China, of India, of Japan, of the Americas, moved through Jesuit hands, was filtered by Jesuit pens, and arrived in Europe wearing a Jesuit frame. If you have followed this story from the beginning, you can already feel the shape of what comes next. Every Jesuit success so far has been converted into an accusation. The schools became infiltration. The confessors became puppet masters. What would the legend make of men who held the ear of the Chinese emperor and decided what Europe knew about half the planet? But this time, the gravest attack did not come from Protestants or pamphleteers. It came from inside the Catholic Church. The dispute is known to history as the Chinese rites controversy, and at its center sat a question of genuine, breathtaking difficulty. Chinese families honored their ancestors with ceremonies, offerings of food and incense before tablets bearing the family names. Scholars, likewise, paid formal honors to Confucius. Ricci had studied these rites for years and reached a judgment. They were civil customs, he concluded, expressions of gratitude and respect, not worship. A Chinese convert to Christianity, therefore, could continue them. The stakes hidden in that ruling were enormous. Without it, becoming a Christian meant abandoning your ancestors, your family's honor, your place in society, all in one step. With it, faith and culture could breathe together. Rival missionaries saw it differently. Dominicans and Franciscans, arriving later and working among different communities, looked at the same incense and the same tablets and saw idolatry. Idolatry varnished over, they said, by Jesuits who had grown far too comfortable in silk. The quarrel ran for a century. Commissions in Rome, appeals, embassies sailing back and forth. The Kangxi Emperor himself, bemused that a court on the far side of the world presumed to rule on the meaning of Chinese customs, declared the Jesuit interpretation correct. Rome ruled the other way. In a series of decisions culminating in a formal decree of 1742, the papacy condemned the Jesuit position and banned the rites for converts. The emperors, insulted, restricted the missions. The greatest evangelization project of the age withered. Two things in that ending deserve a moment of quiet attention. The first is the irony. The order accused across Europe of blind obedience to the Pope had just spent 100 years in open argument with Rome, and lost. Real institutions are like that, full of friction, dissent, and defeat. Legends are not. The second is the residue, the controversy fixed, in the minds of the society's enemies inside the church. A damning portrait. Jesuits, it was now said in Roman corridors, were men who bent doctrine to fit circumstance. Men for whom rules were negotiable when influence was at stake. Men who had gone native in the courts of pagan emperors, compromisers, relativists, too clever to be trusted. Keep that portrait in view. In 3 chapters, when the kings of Europe begin signing expulsion orders, it will be standing silently behind every signature. But first, the story must cross another ocean. Because, while Ricci's successors were correcting the calendar in Beijing, other Jesuits were deep in the river country of South America, building the experiment that the order's enemies would find most threatening of all. Not a mission. This time, something that looked to the colonial powers watching it grow, very much like a country. Chapter 7. The Republic in the Jungle. The Paraná River Country, South America. The late 1600s. A traveler coming up the river toward one of the mission towns would hear it before he saw it. Music. Choirs rehearsing European polyphony. Voices layered over voices. Orchestras of violins, harps, and trumpets. And every one of those instruments built locally, in mission workshops, by indigenous craftsmen who had never seen Europe and never would. Then the town itself comes into view. A great central plaza, a stone church as large as many European cathedrals, its facade carved with angels whose faces, look closely, are Guarani faces. Straight streets of solid housing, workshops, schools, storehouses, and around it all, fields and cattle ranges organized with a precision that travelers compared to the best-run estates of Europe. These were the reductions. The name comes from a Spanish word meaning a settlement where scattered peoples were gathered. In the lands of the Guarani people, across territory that today belongs to Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. The Society of Jesus organized around 30 of these towns. At their height, in the early 1700s, the 30 towns held a combined population that scholarly estimates place at over 140,000 people. If parts of this story feel strangely familiar, there is a reason. A celebrated film called The Mission, released in 1986, dramatized the final years of these towns, and its haunting musical score became famous in its own right. The film took liberties, as films do, but the world it depicted, the waterfalls, the choirs, the catastrophe bearing down, was real. To grasp why these towns existed at all, you need one piece of context that romantic versions of the story tend to soften. The alternative for the Guarani was not free life in the forest. It was slavery. From the east, out of Brazil, came raiding expeditions known as bandeirantes, slave hunters from the region of São Paulo, sweeping through the country and capturing indigenous people by the thousands for sale. From the west pressed the Spanish colonial labor system, which in practice bound native communities to forced work on settler estates. The mission towns offered a third condition. Under Spanish law, secured by years of Jesuit lobbying at court, the Guarani of the reductions were direct vassals of the crown, exempt from settler labor demands, paying tribute to the king instead. Inside the towns, daily life was more self-governing than most modern listeners expect. Guarani councils, with magistrates drawn from the community, administered each town. The resident Jesuits usually numbered just 2, a priest and an assistant, 2 men. In a town of thousands, the economy was communal in structure. Fields worked in common, harvests stored in shared granaries against famine, surpluses shipped downriver to be sold. Above all, the caffeinated leaf called yerba mate, the tea of South America, which funded the towns and paid the royal tribute. And when the slave raids kept coming, the story acquired the detail that colonial governments would never forget. The missions armed. In the 1620s and 30s, Bandeirante attacks devastated whole mission districts. Entire town populations were killed or marched off in chains. Refugee columns, led by the priests, fled hundreds of miles through the forest, carrying what they could. Then the Jesuits did something extraordinary. They went to the Spanish crown and obtained royal permission for an indigenous militia, equipped with firearms. In 1641, at a river battle called Mborore, a Guarani army, organized through the missions, met a large Bandeirante expedition. On the water and along the banks, the Guarani destroyed it. The slave raids on the mission territory effectively ended. For the better part of a century afterward, the towns lived in their strange equilibrium, prosperous, musical, armed. Look closely at that image, because every theme of this story converges in it. A religious order had assembled in the interior of a continent, a network of flourishing towns, more than 100,000 people, a communal economy, and a trained army that had defeated European-led forces in the field. The order answered to a general in Rome. The towns paid tribute to the crown, but kept colonial settlers and colonial labor demands out. The Jesuits called it protection. The settlers of the surrounding provinces, watching a labor force they coveted living beyond their reach, called it something else. A state within a state, an empire of the priests. In Europe, the phrase Jesuit Republic of Paraguay began to circulate. Sometimes, in admiration, the philosophers of the Enlightenment debated it as a real-world experiment in utopia, and sometimes as the gravest accusation yet, proof that the society's ambition was no longer influence, it was sovereignty. Modern historians have complicated both the golden legend and the black one. Barbara Ganson, whose study of the Guarani under Spanish rule drew on mission records and Guarani language sources, found a reality far more tangled than either myth. The towns were not paradise. Epidemics swept through them again and again. Smallpox and measles burning along the river roads. Discipline could be paternal and rigid, and the Guarani were never passive subjects of anyone. They negotiated, they resisted, they shaped the towns around their own traditions, and walked away when it suited them. A complex colonial bargain. Not a fairy tale in either direction, but the bargain held for a century and a half, and then it was destroyed with the stroke of a pen. In 1750, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Madrid, redrawing their colonial boundary in South America. 7 of the 30 mission towns, home to roughly 30,000 people, now stood on land assigned to Portugal. Portugal, the very power whose slave raiders the Guarani had been fighting for 100 years. The treaty required the 7 towns to be abandoned. The people were ordered to leave their churches, their homes, their orchards, the graves of their families, and relocate across the river. The Guarani refused. What followed is known as the Guarani War. In 1756, a combined Spanish and Portuguese army marched on the resisting towns. At a place called Caibatay, the Guarani militia stood against it. The battle lasted a little over an hour. The colonial accounts record some 1,500 Guarani dead. The Allied army lost a handful of men in Lisbon and Madrid. The war was read in exactly one way. The missions had defied 2 crowns by force of arms, and who could have orchestrated such defiance? if not the fathers who had built the towns and trained the militia. Whispers said the Jesuits wanted a kingdom of their own. The historical evidence points the other way. It indicates that the Jesuit leadership, under explicit orders from Rome and from its own general, had urged the Guarani to comply and relocate, that the resistance was the Guarani's own decision, made by a people defending their homes. Several missionaries on the ground, torn between obedience and the communities they had served for decades, ended up accused by both sides at once. It did not matter, because in the capitals of Europe, a new kind of minister was rising, secular, centralizing, impatient of any authority that competed with the state. In Portugal, his name was the Marquis of Pombal, and in the smoke of the Guarani War, Pombal saw exactly the weapon he had been waiting for, the Society of Jesus. He would soon tell Europe was not a religious order at all. It was a rebellious empire, and it was time to destroy it. Chapter 8. Pascal's Pen, Paris, January 1656. A pamphlet is being passed from hand to hand in the salons and bookshops of the city, and people are doing something unusual with a piece of theological writing. They are laughing. The pamphlet is anonymous. It presents itself as a letter from a curious gentleman in Paris to a friend in the provinces, reporting on the strange opinions he has discovered among the city's theologians. The tone is innocent, almost naive. The narrator simply asks learned Jesuit fathers to explain their moral teaching, and then he writes down, with devastating politeness, exactly what they say. Over the following year, 17 more letters appear. Printers produce them in secret, moving the presses from house to house, one step ahead of the police. All of literate France reads them. The author, the public will eventually learn, is a frail young man named Blaise Pascal, 32 years old, already one of the great mathematicians of the century. As a teenager, he had stunned the scientific circles of Paris with a treatise on geometry. He had invented a working calculating machine to help his father, a tax official. With endless arithmetic, he had helped lay the foundations of probability theory in letters with a fellow mathematician about, of all things, gambling problems. He was also a man in almost constant pain. Illness shadowed his whole short life. He would die at 39. And in the winter of 1656, this sick, brilliant man aimed the finest prose style in France at the Society of Jesus. The result is known to history as the Provincial Letters. Critics still rank it among the founding masterpieces of the French language. For our story, it is something more specific. The Monita Secreta was a forgery for the credulous. The Provincial Letters were far more dangerous, a work of genius, built on real quotations. To understand the attack, you need the battlefield. And the battlefield, once again, was the confessional. For a century, Jesuit theologians had been writing manuals for confessors, thick volumes designed to answer a practical question. When a real person, in a real situation, confesses a real act, how should the priest judge it? The discipline was called casuistry, from a Latin word meaning case, case-based moral reasoning. At its best, it was an honest attempt to take human circumstances seriously, to recognize that the same act can mean different things in different conditions, that a starving man who takes bread is not a bank robber. Any modern courtroom, weighing motive and circumstance before sentencing, works on instincts the casuists would recognize. At its worst, It became a marketplace of excuses, because within casuistry there had grown a doctrine with a dry technical name: probabilism. The details are intricate, but the working effect can be said simply: if a respected theological author held that an action was permissible, a confessor could treat it as permissible, even if most authorities disagreed, even if the confessor himself thought the stricter view was right. One sufficiently lenient author, in other words, could function as a permission slip, and among the hundreds of casuists publishing across Europe, lenient authors could always be found. Somewhere, in some volume, was an opinion that excused dueling after certain insults to honor, an opinion that softened the rules of fasting, an opinion that allowed forms of misleading speech under the doctrine called mental reservation, which ordinary people would simply call lying, an opinion that found a path around the Church's own ban on charging interest. Pascal's method was ruthless in its simplicity. He quoted them. He did not write alone. His allies in the austere Catholic movement known as Jansenism, centered on a convent outside Paris and locked in a doctrinal war with the Jesuits, fed him the research, the volumes, the page references. Pascal supplied what no researcher could supply: the voice. He created a fictional Jesuit father, cheerful, helpful, and proud, who explains each indulgent opinion to the astonished narrator. Citation after citation, author after author. The good father is never angry. He is delighted by the cleverness of his own school, and with every delighted explanation, the ground opens a little wider beneath him. The cumulative effect was unanswerable. Here, the letters implied, was an order that had turned moral theology into a service industry. Whatever you have done, somewhere a Jesuit author can be found who will tell you it was not a sin. One idea from the letters entered the permanent vocabulary of Europe. Pascal had his Jesuit explain how the doctrine of directing the intention could soften almost any act. From that discussion, a phrase attached itself to the society and never let go: the end justifies the means. It is attached still, to this day, in English and in French. The word Jesuitical does not mean missionary. It does not mean teacher. It means deviously clever, a master of self-serving distinctions. Now, because this documentary promised you precision at the start, here is what a careful accounting of the episode shows. Pascal quoted accurately. In the main, the lenient opinions existed. They were in print, under church licenses, and the church itself eventually confirmed the substance of the complaint. 2 decades later, Pope Innocent XI formally condemned dozens of lax moral propositions of exactly the kind the casuists had circulated. The rot was real. Rome said so. But the portrait was also a distortion, in 3 ways that historians of moral theology have documented. First, selection. The same Jesuit manuals contained thousands of rigorous opinions, demands of restitution, strict rulings, refusals of absolution. Pascal harvested the indulgent passages and presented the harvest as the whole field. Second, attribution. Casuistry was not a Jesuit invention, and never a Jesuit monopoly. Dominicans, Franciscans, and secular theologians wrote in the same genre. Probabilism itself had been formulated by a Dominican professor decades before. The society was simply the largest and most visible producer. Its name made the better target. Third, motive. The letters were not a neutral audit. They were artillery in a war the Jansenists were losing. Rome had ruled against their doctrine, so the battle was shifted to morals, where the Jesuits stood exposed. None of those corrections mattered to the outcome. Not then, not later. The Jesuit replies were ponderous, defensive, and forgotten. Wit of that caliber cannot be answered by committee. The provincial letters were reprinted for centuries, translated across Europe, and absorbed into the education of exactly the class of men: lawyers, magistrates, philosophers, who would one day sit in judgment on the society. Voltaire admired the letters extravagantly. He and the writers of the Enlightenment inherited Pascal's caricature whole and sharpened it for their own war. By the mid-1700s, an educated European who had never met a Jesuit in his life knew three things about them with perfect confidence. They served a foreign general, they whispered to kings, and they kept a moral system that could justify anything. Each of those beliefs, as you have heard across 7 chapters, stood on a real foundation and rose far beyond it. Rest here a moment, at the edge of the catastrophe, and look at what has been assembled on the table: a forged secret rulebook, a doctrine of tyrannicide, written by one man, banned by his order, remembered as policy, a republic in the jungle, raid as a rehearsal for sovereignty, and now a moral philosophy, prosecuted by the finest pen in France, that the whole world could summarize in 5 words: the end justifies the means. Europe did not need new evidence to destroy the Society of Jesus. It only needed a prosecutor with power. In 1750, in Lisbon, he took office. Chapter 9. The Fall. Lisbon. The morning of November 1, 1755. All Saints' Day. The churches are full when the ground begins to move. The earthquake that strikes Lisbon that morning is one of the deadliest disasters in European history. Stone buildings collapse onto packed congregations. Fires spread from toppled altar candles and burn for days. Survivors who run to the open ground of the riverfront are met by the sea itself, a great wave driven up the river Tagus. Estimates of the dead vary widely, as they always do in catastrophes of this scale. Modern scholarship suggests tens of thousands. In a city of under 200,000 souls, whatever the true number, Europe was shaken to its foundations. Philosophers, from Voltaire onward, asked openly how a just God could permit such a thing. In the wreckage of the city, 2 men rise, and their collision will decide the fate of the Society of Jesus. The first is the king's chief minister, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo. History remembers him by the title he later received, the Marquis of Pombal. He is ruthless, brilliant, tireless, and modern in a way Portugal's old nobility is not. While the court panics and the king refuses ever again to sleep inside a stone building, Pombal organizes: bury the dead, feed the living, rebuild the city on a rational grid. The earthquake makes him, in effect, the dictator of Portugal. The second man is an elderly Jesuit named Gabriel Malagrida, a missionary preacher of immense popular following, back from decades in Brazil, venerated by crowds as a living saint. A year after the disaster, Malagrida publishes a pamphlet. The earthquake, E Declares, was not a natural event. It was the punishment of God upon the sins of Lisbon. The proper response is not reconstruction. It is penance to Pombal. rebuilding a shattered capital. The pamphlet is sabotage of the state itself. It is also an opportunity. Pombal has hated the society for years. In Brazil, where his own brother governed, Jesuit missions stood between colonial enterprise and the indigenous labor it wanted. The same pattern you saw in Paraguay. In the Guarani War, Pombal found his proof of a rebel empire. In Malagrida's pamphlet, he finds his proof that the fathers defy the crown even in its darkest hour. What he still needs is a crime. In 1758, he gets one. On a September night, on a dark road outside Lisbon, the carriage of King Joseph I is ambushed. Shots are fired into it. The king is wounded in the arm and shoulder, but lives. The investigation belongs to Pombal. It moves with terrifying speed, and it moves exactly where he points it, toward the Tavera family. Proud high nobles with their own grievances against the king. Toward the Duke of Aveiro. Arrests follow. Confessions are produced under torture. In January 1759, on a great scaffold built for the occasion, the Taveras and Aveiro are publicly executed before the crowd, with a brutality that shocked even that age. And woven through the prosecution runs Pombal's larger target. The Jesuits, he announces, were the spiritual authors of the crime. Several fathers, including old Malagrida, had been confessors to the Tavera family. That connection, plus the ancient ghost of Mariana's book on tyrannicide, you remember it from chapter 5, is presented as proof. Modern historians who have examined the case find the evidence against the nobles themselves murky. Extracted under torture, the evidence of Jesuit institutional involvement, they find, is essentially non-existent. What Pombal possessed was not proof. It was enough. In 1759, Portugal expels the Society of Jesus. Over 1,000 members are deported, shipped like cargo to the ports of the Papal States. Others are locked in Portuguese fortress dungeons, where many will die over the years that follow. The order's property is seized by the crown, and in 1761 comes the scene that even Voltaire, no friend of the Jesuits, recorded with disgust. The elderly Malagrida, by then visibly senile, his mind unraveling in his cell, is condemned through the Inquisition, which Pombal's government now controlled. On charges built from his deranged late writings, the old missionary is garroted and burned in Lisbon. Before the crowd, in a final piece of medieval theatre staged by a self-proclaimed man of reason, the absurd, Voltaire wrote in Essence, had been joined to the horrible. One kingdom had moved, and the mechanism of the fall was now visible to every court in Europe. It was not a trial of evidence. It was state power. Armed with the legend, France moved next. France did not even need an assassination attempt. It needed a bankruptcy. A Jesuit superior on the Caribbean island of Martinique, a man named Antoine Lavalette, had run a trading operation to fund the missions. It violated the order's own rules. War with Britain sank his ships and his credit, and the collapse left enormous debts. Creditors sued the whole society. The case rose to the High Court of Paris, the same court, you will remember, that had nursed its anti-Jesuit doctrine since the knife of Jean Châtel. A century and a half before, the judges ruled the entire order liable for one mission's debts. Then they seized the occasion they had waited generations for. They put the society's constitutions themselves on trial. The verdict declared the institute perverse, and incompatible with the laws of the kingdom. King Louis XV, pressured from every side, confirmed the dissolution in 1764. Hundreds of French colleges closed their doors. The Jesuits of France were ordered to renounce their vows or leave. Spain followed 3 years later, and Spain was the coldest case of all. After riots in Madrid the previous year, riots whose real causes were economic, a hatred of new taxes and even of new clothing regulations, a secret royal committee reached a conclusion it never published. The Jesuits, it decided, had instigated the unrest. King Charles III signed sealed orders to be opened across his worldwide empire on the same days at dawn, in Spain, in Mexico, in Peru, in the Philippines, in the former mission country of Paraguay. Soldiers knocked on the doors of Jesuit houses. Around 5,000 men were arrested, marched to the coasts, and deported. The king never disclosed his reasons. He stated only that he kept them locked in his royal breast. They are locked there still. Historians have never found a published justification, because none was ever given. Naples and Parma, ruled by branches of the same Bourbon family, expelled the order in turn. Then the courts of France, Spain, Naples, and Portugal united on the final demand, total abolition. By the Pope himself, Pope Clement XIII refused. He defended the order in formal documents, and he died with the question unresolved. The conclave that followed, in 1769, was conducted under open pressure from the Bourbon powers, their ambassadors working the corridors. It elected a Franciscan friar, Lorenzo Ganganelli, who took the name Clement XIV. For 4 years, the new pope delayed. He was pressed in audience after audience. Bourbon troops occupied papal territories and did not leave. The price of their return was written on the wall. On July 21, 1773, he signed Dominus AC Redemptor. This is the scene where our story began, and here is the detail to carry from it. Read the document today, and you will find no verdict, no finding of regicide, no proven conspiracy, no heresy. It states, instead, that the order had become the object of so many accusations, so much conflict, so much discord among Catholic princes, that the peace of the Church required its sacrifice. The Society of Jesus, 23,000 men, more than 700 colleges, the missions of 2 hemispheres, was abolished not as guilty, it was abolished as inconvenient. The last superior general, Lorenzo Ricci, an old man of gentle reputation, was taken to the Castel Sant'Angelo, the papal fortress on the Tiber, and imprisoned there without trial. He was never charged. He was never convicted. He asked, repeatedly, to be told his crime, or given his judges. He died in his cell in 1775, declaring before God his own innocence, and the innocence of the order he had led. And Clement XIV, the Pope who signed, was dead within 14 months. A long decline, fear, insomnia, and at the end, by witness accounts, something close to torment of conscience. Rome whispered a single word. Poison. The whisper, said the Jesuits, or their friends, had repaid the suppression. The medical evidence, examined then and re-examined by historians since, supports natural causes, a frightened, exhausted old man whose health collapsed under the weight of what he had done. No serious modern historian credits the poisoning story, but mark, one final time, the perfect machinery of the legend. The Order's enemies destroyed it without proving a single charge, and when the Pope who destroyed it died, the Order was charged with that too. The Society of Jesus was now extinct, erased by the very church it had served, except that it was not, because at the cold edge of Europe, in the empire of a ruler who took orders from no pope, a handful of Jesuit colleges were about to receive the strangest protection in the history of the Catholic Church. The Society's unlikely savior had just decided that the suppression did not apply to her. Her name was Catherine the Great. Chapter 10. Survival in the Snow. St. Petersburg. The winter of 1773. A courier from Warsaw carries a question that should not need asking. The Pope has abolished the Society of Jesus everywhere on earth. The papal brief is being read aloud in Jesuit houses across Europe, and as it is read, house by house, the order legally ceases to exist. That was how the law of the Church worked. The document took effect in each place only when it was formally published there. But in the territories that Russia had just seized from Poland, in the first great partition of that country, there are 4 Jesuit colleges, 2 residences, and around 200 members of the society. And the ruler of Russia has examined the situation and reached a decision that will bend the next 40 years of church history. The brief will not be read in her empire. Her name is Catherine II. History calls her Catherine the Great. She is German by birth, Orthodox by a conversion of political necessity, a correspondent and admirer of Voltaire, and a Catholic by no definition whatsoever. The Pope's authority means nothing to her in law, so she simply forbids the promulgation. No reading, no suppression. The Jesuits of her new provinces will continue exactly as before, by imperial command. Her reasons, as historians such as Marek Inglot have reconstructed them, were not sentimental. The colleges were the best schools in her newly annexed lands. She had millions of new Catholic subjects to govern, and no desire to wreck the institutions that kept them educated and orderly. Good schools meant quiet provinces, and beneath the pragmatism lay something else. Catherine enjoyed demonstrating that she, and not Rome, decided what happened inside Russia. Protecting the Pope's own elite from the Pope himself was a display of sovereignty that, by every account, amused her considerably. So began the strangest chapter in the Society's long history. The order that legend described as the Pope's secret army now existed only where the Pope's writ did not run, preserved by an Orthodox empress, against the explicit will of Rome. Consider the knot this tied around the men themselves. Were the Jesuits of White Russia, as the region was called, still Jesuits at all? Their general was dying in a papal fortress. Their order was abolished. Obedience to the Pope was the very heart of their identity, and the Pope had dissolved them. Yet their local bishops, under Catherine's firm instruction, directed them to continue. The men agonized. They sent quiet inquiries to Rome, and back came a series of careful, deniable signals. Never a public document. The popes who followed Clement XIV tolerated the survival, and according to multiple contemporary accounts that historians treat as credible, though informal, privately approved it. Verbal message passed through intermediaries. The formula was almost comic in its caution. Rome could not say yes, and would not say no. The Jesuits of Russia took the silence as permission. With Catherine's blessing, they elected a vicar to lead them. They opened a novitiate and began accepting new members, which quietly transformed survival into continuity. An order that can recruit is not a remnant. It is a seed. Former Jesuits began making their way east to rejoin, and in 1801, a new pope, Pius VII, formally approved the society's existence within the Russian Empire. The exception was now official. The candle was burning in the open. Meanwhile, across Europe and the Americas, the suppressed thousands lived on in a kind of institutional afterlife. And here the record holds a detail worth slowing down for, because it quietly demolishes one more piece of the legend. The 23,000 members of the abolished order did not vanish into dungeons. They did not go underground as a hidden network. Whatever later conspiracy writers imagined, the overwhelming majority became what the paperwork said they now were: ordinary priests, ordinary teachers. They taught in the same classrooms under different letterhead, and some built things that outlived everyone in this story. In the newly independent United States, a former Jesuit named John Carroll, member of a prominent Maryland family, his cousin had signed the Declaration of Independence, became the first Catholic bishop of the new republic. In 1789, the same year the Constitution took effect, he founded an academy on a hilltop above the Potomac River. It grew into Georgetown University, so the oldest Catholic university in the United States, the school that would educate senators, diplomats, and a future president, was founded by a Jesuit at a moment when, legally, there were no Jesuits. Keep that American thread in hand. In the next chapter, it becomes central. What finally reopened the society's path was the collapse of the world that had closed it. The French Revolution devoured the Bourbon monarchies that had forced the suppression. The kings who had demanded the order's death lost their thrones, and some of their descendants lost their heads. Napoleon rose, redrew Europe, and imprisoned Pope Pius VII himself for years. And when the wars finally ended, and the old Pope returned to Rome in 1814, the papacy drew a hard lesson from a quarter-century of revolution. The Church had disarmed itself in 1773. It had sacrificed its most capable core to please monarchs whose dynasties were now ash. On August 7, 1814, in the Church of the Jesuits in Rome, where Ignatius lies buried beneath an altar of lapis and gold, Pius VII signed the bull restoring the Society of Jesus throughout the world. In the congregation stood elderly men who had been young priests in 1773. Witnesses describe them weeping. The order, destroyed without a verdict, was revived without an apology, and the 41 years between the two documents were bridged by a handful of houses in the snow, kept open by an empress who never believed a word of their catechism. It is a story of survival against the odds. If this were a legend told by the order's friends, the chapter would end here, warmly. But you have been listening too long tonight to expect that. Ask yourself how the restoration of 1814 looked from the outside. To liberals, to Protestants, to the new nationalist movements stirring across the 19th century, an order accused for 2 centuries of being the papacy's hidden hand is abolished. It survives anyway, beyond the reach of law, by candlelight. Popes approve it in private while saying nothing in public. And it is restored at the precise moment the old monarchies and the papacy regroup against the modern world. The conspiracy theorists did not even have to lie this time. The society really had continued operating after its legal abolition. The popes really had winked at it in secret. Every fact in those sentences has an innocent explanation. You now know each one. but strip the context away, and the same facts read like the synopsis of a thriller. The indestructible order. The brotherhood that no decree can kill. The 19th century printed that thriller in 1,000 variations. In French novels with sinister priests gliding through the shadows. In German politics, where the new empire under Bismarck expelled the order outright in 1872. In speeches, in cartoons, in cheap pamphlets sold at railway stations, and in the young United States, a nation built by Protestants and now filling, decade after decade, with Catholic immigrants. The old European legend was about to find its largest audience yet, and its most American form, a forged oath, entered into the official record of the United States Congress. Chapter 11. The Oath That Never Was. Washington, February 15, 1913. A clerk of the House of Representatives is preparing the congressional record, the official transcript of everything said and submitted in the Congress of the United States, most of it, on most days, is procedure, tariffs, postal roads, contested elections. Into the record of one such contested election, a House race from Pennsylvania, goes a piece of campaign material that had been used in the district. It carries a title that promises everything. The extreme oath of the Jesuits. The text claims to be the secret vow sworn by every senior member of the society. And it is a catalogue of horrors. The candidate. It says, swears before his superiors to wage relentless secret war against Protestants and liberals everywhere. To spare no one. Not age. Not sex. To use any weapon that comes to hand. And the text lists them for half a page, ending with the poisoned cup and the strangling cord. The new Jesuit swears to be a spy inside every government and every army, living as a Protestant among Protestants, awaiting only the signal from the Black Pope in Rome. It reads like a horror novel. There is a reason for that. It is fiction. No such oath exists. None has ever existed. The actual vows of the society have been public since the 1500s, and you heard them in Chapter 2. Poverty, chastity, obedience, and for the senior men, the famous fourth vow, which concerns travel to the missions. Historians who have traced the bloody oath text find a long and well-documented pedigree of fakery. Its core language descends from a 17th-century English forgery, associated with a notorious fabricator of documents named Robert Ware, who invented papers to smear Catholics during England's anti-popery panics. The text was recycled through generations of pamphlets, edited, embellished, and somewhere along the way, the Jesuit name was attached to it. The congressional record episode itself ended in a correction. The oath had been used as an attack in the election dispute, and the House later expunged it from the record, noting that it was spurious and that the committee had found it so. And now you already know what happened next. You have watched this machine run 4 times tonight. The correction never caught the lie, to this day. The oath circulates with the citation attached. Congressional Record. 1913. The very document that records its debunking is cited as proof of its authenticity. The trap built into the Monita Secreta 3 centuries earlier, working perfectly in the age of the telegraph, and later, of the Internet. But how did a European legend become an American institution in the first place? The answer runs through the central anxiety of 19th century America, and through one of its most celebrated minds. Samuel F. B. Morse is remembered today as the inventor of the telegraph, the man whose code of dots and dashes carried the world's messages for a century. Fewer remember his other career. In 1835, Morse published a book called Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. Its thesis was stark. The monarchies of Europe, he argued, led by Austria and the papacy, were using Catholic immigration as a weapon. They were flooding the young republic with obedient subjects who would vote as their priests directed, until American liberty was extinguished from within. And the advance guard of the plot, Morse wrote, its disciplined intelligence service, was the Society of Jesus. Morse was not a marginal crank scribbling in obscurity. He was one of the most famous Americans alive. His book sold through edition after edition. He had absorbed the European legend whole, the Black Pope, the secret instructions, the infiltrators in disguise, and translated it into the American political language of Republican liberty against foreign despotism. In Morse's hands, the Jesuit was no longer merely a threat to Protestant souls. He was a threat to the Constitution. The timing was combustible. Irish and German Catholic immigrants were arriving in numbers the country had never seen. Economic fear, religious fear, and ethnic fear fused into political movements. The most famous was formerly called the American Party, and informally called the Know-Nothings, because members questioned about their secret organization were instructed to answer that they knew nothing. In the 1850s, that movement elected governors, congressmen, and mayors on an openly anti-Catholic platform. Mobs attacked convents and churches. In Philadelphia, in 1844, anti-Catholic riots left churches burned and dozens dead in the streets of an American city. In this market, anti-Jesuit literature was a genre with reliable sales. The Monita Secreta was reprinted for American readers as a genuine captured document. Lurid memoirs by supposed escapees from convents became national bestsellers, their details invented, their profits real. And always, behind the literature, stood the figure that Europe had spent 3 centuries perfecting. The Jesuit who is never where you can see him, working through schools, through politics, through the confessional. There was even an American assassination to feed the legend. After President Abraham Lincoln was murdered in 1865, the fact that several figures connected to the conspiracy, including the family that kept the boarding house where the plotters met, were Catholics, became the seed of a durable theory. A former priest named Charles Chiniquy, who had once known Lincoln as his lawyer in Illinois, published books claiming the assassination had been ordered by the Jesuits and directed from Rome. Serious historians of the Lincoln assassination have found no evidence for the claim. The standard scholarly accounts of the crime do not credit it. Chiniquy's books sold for 50 years anyway. They are quoted online tonight. By the 20th century, the legend had a permanent American address. The revived Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s, at its peak claiming millions of members, made anti-Catholicism a central pillar alongside its racism. And the Jesuit oath circulated in Klan literature. When Al Smith, a Catholic, ran for president in 1928, the oath and its relatives surfaced in the whisper campaign against him. And when John F. Kennedy ran in 1960, he judged the old suspicion still strong enough that he stood before an audience of Protestant ministers in Houston and declared, on national television, that he would not take orders from the Pope. A speech made necessary, in a direct line you can now trace by a Polish forger, a French genius, and a Portuguese minister. Step back and look at what the legend had achieved in America. It had survived the correction of Congress, the verdicts of historians, the assimilation of the very immigrants it targeted, whose grandchildren now ran the cities it had warned against. And it had done all of this against an order whose American reality was, by any sober measure, spectacularly unhidden. More than 24 colleges and universities, Georgetown first among them, high schools in every major city, names carved over doorways, faces in yearbooks, filings in public records, the secret army, it turned out, published course catalogues. That irony might serve as the closing joke of this whole long history, except that history was preparing one final reversal, and it is not funny at all, because in the late 20th century, in a small country in Central America, armed men would come for the Jesuits in the night, and this time, the conspiracy against them would not be a forgery. It would be documented by a commission of the United Nations. Chapter 12. Blood in El Salvador, San Salvador. The night of November 15, 1989. In a small Central American country torn apart by civil war, soldiers of an elite army unit are receiving an order that investigators will later examine word by word. For years, the order concerns a priest. His name is Ignacio Ellacuría. He is the rector of the Central American University, known across the region by its initials, the UCA. He is 59 years old, a philosopher, born in the Basque country of Spain, the same hills that produced Ignatius of Loyola 4 centuries earlier, and trained in Europe before giving his life to El Salvador. For years, Ellacuría has used the university as a platform. His institutes analyze the Civil War. They document its costs in numbers no one else will publish. And he argues, relentlessly, in print and on television, for the one outcome both extremes hate, a negotiated peace. He is also a Jesuit. The order given that night, as later established by official investigations, is to kill him and to leave no witnesses. In the early hours of November 16, soldiers of a rapid response battalion enter the university campus. They move to the Jesuit residence. They order the priests out of their rooms and onto the ground in the back garden, among the rose bushes. And there, where they lie, the soldiers carry out the order. 6 priests die in the garden and the residence that night. Ignacio Ellacuría, the rector. Ignacio Martín Baró, a social psychologist whose research on the trauma of war populations is still cited today. Segundo Montes, a sociologist who documented the refugees fleeing the country. Juan Ramón Moreno, Armando López, and Joaquín López y López, the only one of the 6 born in El Salvador. An old man already sick with cancer. Then, because the order was to leave no witnesses, the soldiers turned to the 2 women who had taken shelter in the residence that night, believing it the safest place in a city under fire. Julia Elba Ramos, a cook, and her daughter Selena. Selena was 16 years old. They die too. Before leaving, the soldiers stage the scene. They fire weapons associated with the guerrillas. They scrawl a message on a wall, attributing the killings to the insurgents. The cover story is already in place before the soldiers leave the campus. Now set this night against everything you have heard across the previous 11 chapters. Because the inversion is total, for 4 centuries, the legend placed the Jesuit behind the assassin, whispering, directing, supplying the doctrine. On this night, The documented record shows the opposite arrangement in every detail. The assassins were soldiers of a state. The conspiracy was planned at the highest level of a military, and the men face down in the garden were the Jesuits. This time, there is no ambiguity to weigh, no forged document to unmask, no debate among historians about what happened. The evidence trail here is among the most thoroughly established in this entire story. It is worth saying exactly where it comes from. In 1992, the peace accords that ended the Salvadoran Civil War created a Commission on the Truth for El Salvador. Established under the auspices of the United Nations, its report, published the following year under the title From Madness to Hope, examined the university case in detail. The commission found that the order to kill Ellacuría and leave no witnesses was given by the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces himself, in the presence of other senior officers, that the operation was then carried out by the elite battalion, and that senior officers afterward worked to conceal the truth and obstruct the investigation. A national trial had already convicted 2 officers. Though under the country's amnesty law, they were later released. Decades afterward, the case crossed the Atlantic. In 2020, a court in Spain, exercising jurisdiction because 5 of the murdered priests were Spanish citizens, convicted a former Salvadoran colonel and vice minister for his role in planning the murders. The sentence ran to more than 130 years. Why were they killed? The Commission's findings, and the scholarship since, point to the answer with uncomfortable clarity. Ellacuría and his colleagues were killed for the same activity that runs through this entire history like a thread. Education, analysis, the production of inconvenient knowledge. The university's institutes documented the war's victims by name. Its polling center asked a frightened population what it actually thought, and published the answers. In the eyes of the military faction that ordered the killings, that made the campus the intellectual headquarters of subversion, the men in the garden were not killed despite being teachers. They were killed for it. And El Salvador was not an isolated case. Across Latin America in those decades, priests and church workers who stood with the poor under dictatorships and civil wars paid in blood. In 1977, the Salvadoran Jesuit Rutilio Grande was assassinated on a country road, an event that transformed his friend, Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was himself shot dead at the altar 3 years later. In Argentina, under the dictatorship, priests and seminarians of a Buenos Aires parish community were massacred in 1976. The killings of 1989 were the culmination of a pattern, not an exception to one. There is a question buried in this chapter, and an honest documentary should surface it rather than smooth it over. Some of the accusations against the university Jesuits in their own time were sincerely held. Critics, including some within the church itself, charged that liberation theology, the movement with which Ellacuría was associated, mixed faith too deeply with politics, that the priests had taken a side in the war. That debate was real. It was conducted in Rome as well as in San Salvador, and it remains a serious subject of study today. You can hold that entire debate in all its complexity, and the verdict of the courts and the Truth Commission stands unchanged. Whatever one concludes about their analysis, they were scholars and priests, and they were murdered by agents of a state for what they wrote and taught. In November 2009, on the 20th anniversary of the killings, the government of El Salvador awarded the murdered priests the country's highest civilian honor. The president who presented it spoke on behalf of the very state whose army had killed them. 400 years before that night in the garden, This story began with an order accused of killing kings, on evidence that has never been found. It pauses here with an order whose members were killed by order of a high command, on evidence confirmed by a commission of the United Nations, a national court, and a foreign one. History rarely arranges its ironies so precisely. What history has not done is tell us what to make of them. For that, we have one chapter left, and one last journey back to a July morning in Rome. Chapter 13. What we know, what we do not. Rome, July 21, 1773. An old man signs a document that destroys an army. We began there. We return there now. But you are no longer the same listener who heard that scene the first time. You now know what stood behind the signature, not a verdict. The document convicted the society of nothing. Behind the signature stood a forged rulebook from Krakow, a banned book on tyrannicide, remembered as policy. A republic in the jungle, read as treason. The finest satire in the French language, a Portuguese minister with a scaffold, and 3 royal courts that found it easier to abolish an order than to disprove a legend. Soletus do. At the end, what we promised at the beginning. Let us state plainly what the record shows, what it does not, and why the question in our title is still being asked. 2.5 centuries later, here is what the documented record establishes. The Society of Jesus was a genuinely unprecedented organization, global, mobile, centralized, and superbly educated. It accumulated real power of a kind Europe had no category for. Its members stood beside kings in rooms without witnesses. One of its theologians defended tyrannicide in print, and its general banned the doctrine under obedience. Its missionaries reached the court of China and armed the Guarani against slavers. Its moral writers produced opinions lax enough that a pope condemned dozens of them. It was expelled by Portugal, France, and Spain. On accusations the surviving evidence does not sustain. It was abolished by a pope under political pressure, preserved by an Orthodox empress, and restored 41 years later. And, in the 20th century, its members in Latin America were murdered by state forces for their teaching, a fact established by courts, and by a commission of the United Nations. Here is what 3 centuries of opened archives have not produced. A secret instruction to assassinate anyone. An authentic version of the bloody oath. Documented proof that the society, as an institution, ordered the death of any king, any pope, any rival. The poisoning of Clement XIV, examined and re-examined, dissolves into the ordinary death of an exhausted man. The Lincoln theory dissolves into the grievances of one former priest, and the pattern is consistent across every case this documentary has examined. Where the legend makes its strongest claims, the evidence is weakest. Where the evidence is strongest, it convicts the order's enemies, or it convicts the order of nothing worse than talent, ambition, and the occasional arrogance of an elite. Yet the honest accounting cannot stop there, because the legend did not grow from nothing, and you have seen its roots with your own eyes tonight. An order that demands obedience like a corpse should not be astonished when outsiders imagine corpses. An order that stands beside every throne should not be astonished when it is blamed for what thrones do. The Jesuits were never the secret killers of the legend. They were something more interesting. They were the first organization in history to discover how much fear pure competence can generate, and how little evidence fear requires. There is a second reading of this whole history, and fairness requires giving it a voice. A skeptic can argue that we have been measuring the wrong thing. Institutions of that size, the skeptic says, do not leave signed orders. Influence does not archive well. The absence of a smoking document proves only discretion, not innocence. That argument deserves to be taken seriously. And then it deserves the answer that the historical method gives it. A claim that no evidence could ever disprove is not a strong claim. It is an unfalsifiable one. It is the same trap built into the Monita Secreta 4 centuries ago, where every denial becomes confirmation. At some point, after the archives of the Vatican, of Spain, of Portugal, of France have been opened and combed by generations of scholars, many of whom had every motive to find the secret. The verdict of silence is itself a form of evidence. The story has one final scene. History saved it for our own lifetime. Rome, March 13, 2013. White smoke rises over the Sistine Chapel, and a man steps onto the balcony of St. Peter's who has never stood there before in the entire history of the church. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, of Buenos Aires. He takes the name Francis. He is a Jesuit. The order, once abolished by a pope, had now produced one. The Black Pope legend, which always imagined a hidden Jesuit hand behind the white robes, was answered by history in the most literal way imaginable. A Jesuit in the white robes, elected in the open, on the evening news, and within hours, predictably, the old machinery turned over once more. Websites dusted off the extreme oath. The Monita found new readers. The legend, 4 centuries old, simply absorbed the event and continued, because that is what unfalsifiable stories do. Which leaves the last question to you, and it is bigger than the Jesuits. This was never really a story about one religious order. It is a story about how fear chooses its objects, how forgery outlives correction, how real facts, a vow, a school, a confessional, can be assembled into a phantom that no archive can kill. The same machinery that built the Jesuit legend has been rebuilt again and again against other groups, with consequences far bloodier than anything that ever happened to the Society of Jesus. You have now watched that machinery assembled, piece by piece, across 400 years, in slow motion. So, the next time a document surfaces that confirms everything you already suspected, the next time a denial sounds like proof, the next time a story explains too much, too neatly, you will recognize the shape. The forgeries of this legend are still being printed. The oath is still being shared. And the question in our title now belongs to you. Along with the evidence to answer it, sleep well,